How you doing, John?
Hey, Dan. Pretty good.
Nick, I gotta say, I learned so much from you the other day.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I now have a sparring partner. You told me how to use my cat.
You didn't think of that before?
Yeah.
I haven't tried it yet, but I really want to.
Problem, my cats don't like ham, so I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I'll figure it out.
Your cat's name is Fabris, Mo. You better figure it out ASAP.
He's so much better at measure than me, though.
Try
No
spaghetti.
one said you had to be good. We want the cat.
Rude.
I tell you guys, and I tell you guys, use your cats. They're the best cavazione partner around.
Nick, I think you need to post the link in the chat so John can have it for after class.
Oh, I've seen it. I've
You
seen
have?
it.
Okay, good.
Nothing I haven't done already.
Did you have a Kermit the Frog Muppet too?
No. But everything I know about tempo, I learned from my cat.
Well, I'm shit out of luck then. Mine's slow.
You have to stop drugging it.
Just put catnip on the tip of your sword.
That works.
She's not a big Nip fan.
Wouldn't that just slow her more, though?
Your cat sounds really boring.
She is. She's the most boring cat to play with because she'll just sit there and stare at whatever toy you have and then be like, do it again. I'm like, what? No.
Entertain me, peasant.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, my cat's in my lap right now, clawing the shit out of my leg.
That means he got the measure on you. Okay, let's get started. So, hope everybody's doing well. So today we are going to, at least for part of the class, look at another chapter of Fabris. This one on holding the sword extended. This is a fairly simple passage, or let's say deceptively simple. It is not, or at least I don't find it terribly obscure. It's fairly clear in everything it says, but it holds a wealth of information about what Fabris is all about, and also what he was up against in fencers of the day. So one reason I really like this chapter. First off, everybody's read it, right? Okay. One reason I really like this chapter is that this is one of those places where Fabris describes a variety of ways of doing things and kind of gives you the pros and cons of most of them. It's one of those passages where he basically tells you there's not one way to fence. He obviously gives you a preference and does talk about his preferences more than he talks about the rest, but he does point out that everything is good for something, and that there is no one way that you want to fence ever. Whereas some ways might be safer, some ways might be better for attacking, some for defense. He tells you right at the end that you should never limit yourself to one particular way. And one of the reasons that he doesn't necessarily mention is that you don't want to be predictable to your opponent. You need to have every tool available for the correct application, and you need to change things up. So that your opponent can't pin yourself down. You need to be so much more flexible than he is, and that's what makes not necessarily a good fencer, but an unpredictable fencer, a dangerous fencer. All right, everybody following me so far? Okay. So he starts off by talking about some of the standard ways that people fence. And I can show you some of them right here. This, by the way, is my very first PowerPoint presentation. I've never actually had to do one before, and it's extraordinarily simple. But, so everybody can see this? This is basically what he's talking about right at the beginning. People who hold their sword at a fairly comfortable angle in front of them. And this is an illustration from Marozzo. And so we're talking about 70 years earlier. But this was a very, very standard way of fencing. And it still is today. And in fact, there we are in a version that Fabris shows you. This is what we call his natural terza. We understand that this is a natural angled guard. It is a comfortable guard, or at least more comfortable than any other way, because the hand does not strain itself. You're not cocking the wrist forward. You're not straining to keep a straight line. You're holding the sword in a fairly natural angle, and there are advantages to this. It is stronger in some ways, but it is less appropriate for other reasons, and Fabris is not particularly fond of it. It does not really match with his style, as we'll see. But this is, forward inclined body and all, this is kind of his version of the standard, what I think of the standard fencing of the day. With a, or shall we say, not the standard, but maybe the common fencing of the day. This is probably what he would consider vulgar fencing. And by vulgar, it doesn't have the same pejorative meaning that we give it now. It's more, you know, this is kind of fencing of the people, shall we say. All right. So you can see this is basically just, you know, a very forward, more linear version of this, where the sword is extended out in front of you, but, you know, in more of a rapier fashion, trying to advance the sword, cover more of the line. So this is basically what, you know, the standard, what we call what was called the coda longa guard, the long tail guard of the 16th century. This is what it would have become by Fabris's day. Now, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about this. Actually, he will, just by comparing it to his preferred guards. But you know, he states this, and then he tells you about another way that people hold the sword, which may be a little bit more rapier friendly, and it looks something like this. Now, this is a fairly extreme version that we're looking at on the fencer on the left right now, where he talks about the sword fairly refused, but very much in a line with the forearm. And so right off the bat, what do people see as the advantages of this?
Your measure is somewhat disguised from your opponent.
Okay, tactically, yes. How about just in terms of the guard, you know, of its defensive and offensive capability?
Your hand and forearm are withdrawn, so they're no longer a target.
Okay, the arm's not a target. Good point. What about the sword?
Because it's not a fully straight, it's more mobile.
Good one. Yes. And that is going to be a theme throughout Fabris's book, and he especially returns to it in book 2 when he lays down his techniques for proceeding nonstop against the opponent. This plate, in fact, comes from his 6th rule of proceeding against the opponent from book 2. But it's probably the one plate that illustrates the best what he's talking about in this passage. It's more flexible because it's stronger. I mean, I think everybody has experienced this, right? The farther away from you, the more you extend your arm, the weaker you feel, right? The harder it is to wave the sword around. Pull it in, and all of a sudden you're pulling it into your core, you're relaxing your muscles, and you have a lot more strength to manipulate the sword. So,
You don't get as tired?
I beg your pardon?
You don't get as tired?
Correct, yes. Yeah, I mean, you don't get as tired, and you are stronger. I mean, the two things work together. Stronger in some ways, stronger specifically in your ability to move the sword from place to place. Also stronger in your ability to resist. You hold the sword way out in front of you with extended arm, and someone pushes on your sword, and you don't quite have the same, regardless of your structure, you don't necessarily have the same strength as if you pull it into yourself. So in that way, it's a much stronger guard. What about the vulnerability of the sword? If you look at the fencer on the right, who is in a much more standard guard, for Fabris at least, what do you see? So let's say that the fencer on the left is going to find the the sword of the fencer on the right. So what do we see? The fencer on the right, his sword is basically asking for it, right? The more you extend it, the more you're saying, hey, dummy, come and get my double A. Who the dummy is depends on, you know, who is more ready for the given situation, right? But if you pull your sword away, keeping that straight line of arm and sword, so basically maintaining that good structure from the elbow, but withdrawing it, now you're pulling your double A away from him, and he's going to find it a lot harder to find your sword. Dan mentioned deceptive measure. If the fencer on the right were to step forward and try and gain the guy on the left sword and step into measure, he would immediately find himself in a much closer measure than he expected. Right? And in fact, fencer on the left may be able to hit him with just an arm extension, depending on, you know, how far he stepped in. Right? So that's what happens to measure. That's not exactly what Fabris is talking about right now, but it's definitely a consideration. All right, everybody seeing that? Okay. So that is the second thing that he's talking about. And here's another example from earlier in the book, and I think we looked at this plate a couple of weeks ago. This is Fabris's, a version of Fabris's quarta, or rather one of Fabris's versions of quarta, the strong inside quarta, where he is creating a strong structure on the inside against an angled seconda. Right? Yeah, we talked about this 2 weeks ago when we talked about finding a sword. So this uses that same idea, right? The sword is more refused, right? The elbow is quite bent. The sword is closer to the body. This makes him much stronger so that he can more easily manipulate the threat that's in front of him. At the same time, he's maintaining that strong line of forearm and sword. So he's not breaking his structure. Also notice that unlike a well-formed quarta, here he's actually turning his left shoulder a little forward, right? He's not so much in profile. The left shoulder comes forward, and this is kind of part of the same idea of pulling that sword in, increasing your physical strength. Just like extending the arm, it conveys a lot of advantages, you know, increased cover, and increased reach, but it weakens you. Turning to a full profile, however well it creates a structure for thrusting or and a refusal of the body for defense, it also physically weakens you. Right? And I'm sure you've all experienced this in your lunging, especially when you hyperextend in your lunge, right? That finish of the lunge tends to feel kind of weak because you are so extended from the point of your sword all the way through your shoulders that you do not feel as strong, and you can be easily parried. Here is a situation where Fabris is creating a strong inside line by not only refusing his sword, not only maintaining that linear structure from the elbow, but by turning his left shoulder forward, basically bringing his entire core together to create more strength in the parry. This is something you can experiment with yourself. You know, extend your arm, profile your body, and, you know, push a weight from one side or another. Then do the same thing, refusing your elbow, turning your left shoulder forward, using your core to back and forth, and see how that works. Essentially, when you turn yourself to profile, you are almost taking your core out of the equation for any purpose other than forward thrust. Does that make sense, everybody? Yeah. Okay. So that's just what's going on with this particular plate. I mostly put that up there to show you another example of what he's talking about with the refused arm. But it's a good example in that this guard is specifically all about physical strength on the inside, and that's what that refusal of the elbow is about, right? Other than, you know, pulling the double A away from the opponent. Now Fabris starts talking about what it would seem to be his preferred way of holding the sword, because he spends about a whole page talking about it. And that's fully extending the arm, straight line out from the shoulder. Something that looks like this. That's from a book, a German book from 1615 by Joachim Koppe, who was some think an actual student of Fabris, but he was definitely continuing the Fabris tradition and explaining a Fabrician style of fencing in his book. And this is what he shows. In fact, if you look at a lot of German texts that are following the Fabris tradition, you'll see the standard terza guard in this mode where the arm is straight out from the shoulder, basically hyperextended. Right? And of course, you know, we know that that's a fairly natural thing to do, because most of us who use the Fabris stance have done this at one time or another, and have heard me say, no, don't do that. Right? Relax the arm. And we'll get to that in a bit. But this is a very hyperextended form of arm and sword right out from the shoulder. And Fabris spends quite a bit of time talking about it. And mostly because he wants to talk about the advantages of getting the sword out there as much as possible. All right, so I've talked enough. Somebody tell me, anybody tell me, what is an advantage of getting the sword out there as much as possible? According to Fabris, according to yourself, according to your observations.
It's intimidating to the opponent.
Well, there's that. What? Okay, why? Why?
Because your point is right in their face, and they have to get around it just to get at your body, and it's hard to do.
Yep, exactly, exactly. What is leaving aside blade engagement? What's the one danger you have to guard against in relation to what you just said? Fabris even tells you. No fair looking at the text.
I'm not looking, I'm trying to remember. I think it's that because your double A is closer, so it's easier for them to get their forte on your double A.
Right, but other than with blade engagement. I mean, you're absolutely right, but just in terms of spatial relationship.
Your feet are open.
Your feet are, okay, but notice that he's not in a very wide stance. And in fact, Fabris makes a point of saying, when holding the sword in this manner, proceed on a small step, precisely because your feet are going to be more exposed.
You can't use your arm to advance the sword. You have to use your body and your feet, and you'll have to pass. Okay.
But again, in terms of the danger that is the danger of, okay, I'm sticking the sword out at you. I'm intimidating you, I'm keeping you away. What do I have to keep from happening most of all?
You have to keep, go ahead.
I was going to say, just keep them from getting past it, because once they're past, then you're pretty stuck.
Exactly. Has anybody here not played Thug and Fencer? Right. This is it. This is basically it. In this form, once he gets past your point, your options start to be limited. Now, You could break measure, you could pull your sword back and try to get it back in line, but basically his whole strategy for dealing with you is to get past your point. Now, he may be using his sword to move it aside as well. He may be trying to find it and get past it that way. But basically, you stick your point out at him, and you have to keep him there. You have to keep it in front of him at all times. And that's where we get into the problems with this guard, because as you've experienced, and as I've said before, the more extended you are, the more hyperextended you are, the harder it is to control your weapon. So if he's merely trying to run past your point, you may be able to redirect it towards him, fairly easily just by turning your body, or what was I going to say? You may be able to do that, but if he gets too close to your point, what happens? He can more easily slide past it, right? With a girata or something, So not only do you have to keep him in front of the point, but keep him at a certain distance from your point. And Fabris makes this very point near the end of the chapter. Then if he goes to find your sword, and Mark was going to talk about this, if he engages your sword, now you absolutely have to keep your own sword free. Once your sword's not free, that omnipresent threat of the point is gone. Right? And so now we have the greatest difficulty of this guard is controlling your point in order to keep it free. Because it's not just a matter of using your body to move it from side to side, but you have to be prepared to move that point very, very deftly. And he tells you that this is the difficulty of this guard. On the other hand, he tells you, well, but once you got it mastered, you got something really good going there. Right? So in other words, something to practice. Right? What else does he say about this guard? Let's think defensively. Other than the point, what are the advantages here?
Really hard to find.
How so?
Because your sword is online and very level. There's not as much of an angle to exploit.
Okay, so what you mean is harder to attack through. Right. Actually, as we just finished talking about, it's actually relatively easy to find because it's so much closer to you, right? But find and then attacking through it, yep, that's a problem, right? Very small openings. Obviously, as Mark pointed out, the low line looks open, but you got to get there, and there's a point in front of you, right? Yes, there's a lot here that looks open, but if you're going to attack with any degree of safety and not impale yourself on that point, you've got to deal with the sword, and that means going through it, and that means creating an opening through the sword, and there isn't a very big one, right? In fact, this is probably what creates the smallest possible openings, especially if, as with Fabris's stances, your body is very much forward to begin with. And of course, this is what Fabris's well-formed terzo looks like. Right? So there we can definitely see the openings are very minimal. Right? You go a little bit under the sword, and you can't reach the torso because it's so far away, and you run into the point. Right? If you try to take a swipe at his leg, there's the point. If you try to hit his face, well, if you try to hit his face, then what? I mean, you could come from under the sword and attack through it to get the face.
Then he gets your face.
Well, okay.
Or you.
And that's exactly what he says, right? in this situation, well, actually, he talks about, yeah, no, he does talk about this. In this situation, specifically, if we look at this plate and we imagine those are actually two people facing off against each other, it's not. It's just, you know, two sides of the same guard. But if they were fencing, those swords are parallel, right? Parallel lines don't really interact. So if one person attacks the other, even trying to go through the other sword, now it's really a game of who was a little bit better in placing their forte on the double A than the other guy. Right? And that, especially if no one has found each other's sword to begin with, that can be a very tricky operation. So that brings us to the actual advantage here, is that not only is the point very far forward, but the forte is very far forward. Actually, let's go back to this one because this one is a little different. All right, the more you extend the sword, the farther forward your forte is. And as we know from the whole cone of defense concept, the farther it is, the less it has to move side to side or up and down to protect you, right? He specifically talks about cuts, about defending against cuts. Now, if now here, let me just unshare for a second, and so I'm just going to demonstrate this myself here. So if I am sticking this right at you, and you want to come at me with a cut, right? Well, a cut is an angle, right? This is actually my favorite letter opener. So a cut has got to come down at an angle in order to slice through the target. If a cut comes straight down, it's not going to do anything except bonk you, right? So here's the cut coming, and there's the straight line. So if that cut comes down, say, this way, there's the forte. Comes down this way, there's the forte. Right? So in other words, regardless of whether he thrusts or cuts, the forte is perfectly placed with a minimal motion to intercept it. Let's go back here. And that, and those are some of the defensive advantages of the guard that he talks about. Now, who, I think, was it Dan who talked about, Dan or Mark, I forget who, talked about the lunge. There is no arm extension in the lunge here, right? There will be a little bit of body, unless, of course, your body already, hang on a second, looks like that. There's going to be very little extension of the body, too. It's all going to be about the feet, right? You're already as extended as you're going to be. You simply have to rely entirely on your feet to drive a sword in. And this is not natural for a lot of us. Even, I mean, how many times have I, critiqued people saying, okay, so you're in this nice extended guard and now lunge, and now you're hyperextending your arm. Well, you really don't need to, because your arm already is fairly extended. This is a skill to learn. Trusting that your sword is extending as it needs to be. What do you need to push forward? Your body. Is your body already extended? You still need to push your body forward, but you're doing it with your legs. Right? So for Fabris, the ideal attack is body is completely in place, right? The tempo happens, you just drive that weapon in like a battering ram with your legs, and then recover the same way without changing anything about your guard, right? If the world went entirely according to plan at all times, that's how it would happen for Fabris. So he wants you to be adept at not only controlling your weapon in that space, which of course is made harder by the strong extension of the arm, all right? But he also wants you to learn to almost forget about your arm and body as you lunge. Right? It's all your arm and body are there, and you simply need to push it in. And this, especially at the turn of the 17th century, this was a new thing. This was called a punta portata, a carried thrust, and you know it had a history to it, but mostly with pole weapons. Thrusting with just the body and legs felt quite alien to a lot of people for a lot of this period, because let's face it, everybody here, right? You want to stick it in, and you feel that your arm is what's going to do it. The arm is there to place the weapon. The body, the legs are there to drive it in. And it's one reason why Fabris likes passing so much, because you're in your guard and you simply walk it in. So that's what those are some of the things he talks about with this particular guard, this particular way of holding the sword. Anybody have any questions or comments? Okay.
Nope.
Now he starts talking about angles. All right. Actually, let me just go back to the text here. Okay. So he's talked about straight lines, right? And he says this requires great practice, right? You have to learn to lunge without flinging your arm at all. You have to learn to keep your arm in the correct position. And then he talks about those who hold the sword at an angle. They do fortify their sword, right? It is a much more natural and thereby physically stronger way to hold your sword. And we looked at this, and we looked at the Terza guard and finding the sword like months ago. You find the sword by keeping a straight line, dropping your elbow below their point. But if their point's too low, you need to lower your hand, and thereby create that natural angle between arm and sword. Right? Like that. Where am I? There we go. Like that. Right? And I mentioned that this is totally fine, because it actually is a strong way of placing his sword under yours. And if he tries to push through, you can simply push your arm down into his sword, and your blade will bury his. So it is strong, but it is problematic for other reasons. What are some of the things that are a problem with angled guards like that? And by angled guards, we're talking about,
Larger opening to attack?
Yes, larger opening to attack, okay? And what do you specifically mean by that?
If you close one side, you open up the other.
Well, that's true with any guard.
Okay.
So what, why is it a larger opening for my opponent's attack?
Double A is further away from the forte.
Right, or rather it's a different plane, right? And actually this plate is where Fabris talks about that. He says if you draw a line, a straight line, and by that he means a horizontal line, from my double A to my body, you'll see that line is very far away from the point. From my forte. So in this guard, if he knows how to attack through my double A, my parries are going to be a lot slower, right? Because my forte is so far away. All right. What else? What other problems do we have here?
You can end up taking the tip too high to where your point's out of presence.
You could. It's still a matter of controlling your point, but that's definitely a danger. certainly the more you angle it upward. Anything else?
Very hard to calve.
Very hard to calve, exactly, right? And of course, the farther he penetrates your sword in the engagement, the bigger their cavazione is going to be. And that is probably one of the biggest tactical disadvantages that Fabris does not like about this particular guard. It just makes getting the point from A to B a huge undertaking, as opposed to a sword that's totally horizontal. There's also another danger, and this is, we still see it today. A sword, if a guard in this position, it's much harder to perform that punta portata I just talked about, that carried thrust, because the first thing you have to do is direct your point to the target, right? You're not already on target. You have got to straighten out sword and arm. That action most typically happens with an extension of the arm. And so that's where you get the flung thrust that Fabris does not like. All right? This was a big issue throughout the 16th century. In many ways, rapier fencing arose in reaction to that, to flung thrusts and uncontrolled actions. Now, of course, in the 16th century, the swords tend to be shorter and more easily controlled, but the longer they got, the more of an issue this became. Right? So we have facility for flung thrusts, we have difficulty with cavazione, we have big honking openings and slow parries. So what are some of the advantages of these angle guards? Remember, Fabris is all about the advantages and disadvantages of various guards here. I've already talked about one, right? If you place your opponent's sword under yours in this position, you actually have quite a bit of strength and ability to, if you turned your edge down into his sword, you can actually resist him quite a bit. You can bury his sword. What else?
You can yield.
You can yield. You've been reading the text. Yeah, so now he talks about angles and what angles are good for. Angles are good for offense, he said, bad for defense. What does he mean by that? He means something like this. All right? There's an angle. This is also from book 2, by the way. But this is the one time he actually illustrates a yield in seconda. We've all learned this, right? We know what an angle seconda is, and basically, this is an angle going. This is a case of an angle defeating an angle, right? He says in the text, angles can pass through one another with facility. Here's a really good example. Fencer on the right. All right, the opponent has tried to use an angled terza or quarta to parry on the inside, right? And fencer on the left simply turns the seconda and just goes around it. Right? Nothing we haven't done. You can have the same scenario in almost any line. If we're both in an angle, here, let me draw something really quickly. So let's say, here, I'm just going to draw over this. So let's say my opponent is giving me that, right? So we're seeing this from above. So that would be, say, an angled seconda, right? I'm over here. And I give him another angled seconda. Right? So basically, we've created two parallel lines there again, right? I can pass this way, and my angled seconda comes over his arm and away from his sword. Or we can look at, let's say he gives me he gives me an angled quarta. And I give him an angled seconda, right? Either above or under his blade. You can see that neither one of our weapons really presents an obstacle to the other, right? Remember, we're seeing this from above, so the swords are crossing on top of each other. Right? So I can simply slide my blade right through the angle that he's creating. Whereas if we have two straight lines, now we slide through each other and kill each other. Right? Or we have the situation where I have to first find him and slide through him. Right? And now it's a game of who finds whose sword best soonest. Right? It's tempo and the subtlety is a blade engagement. So angles, like you said, can pass through each other easily. And that's something to remember. Whether I'm in a angled seconda and he's in an angled terza and I simply wrap around it, or I'm in an angled quarta and he's in an angled terza, he can slip under my sword. Right? These are all the ways that angled blades can interact. If he is, however, in an angled guard, and I am in a straight guard, holding the sword fully extended in front of me, now he has to deal with my debole. Yeah, well, he has to deal with my debole and with my forte. Right? He may try to engage me with his angle, and I simply displace him with the slightest motion of my forte. Or if he tries to angle around me, and we saw that the other day. I don't have that plate available. But if he tries to angle a seconda around me, we saw a few weeks ago that I could take a strong quarta, place the hilt against his blade, and create a straight line to his body. Right? Probably with a little bit of a void too. So the point here is that straight lines are much better for defense. Right? The point is on line to keep him away. The forte is in line to defend against anything he's going to do. If I create an angle to get around his defense, but not to defend. Angles are not good for defense because they can way too easily be moved around or pushed to the side. All right. Everybody following me? Okay. I'll take that for a yes. Okay. Now, lastly, after telling you all the advantages of that straight hyperextended guard, he says, he's telling you basically it's a really tough one to do, and maybe the disadvantages outweigh the advantages, and you may be better off with something like this or like that. But then he says, to be safest of all, what does he want you to do? Well, let's come back to his well-formed terza. This is not his well-formed terza, this is. What difference do we see?
The body is refused.
Body is refused, yeah. I mean, the body is refused here, not as much, but in terms of arm and sword, the same. There's a difference. So here, this is where in some of the last paragraphs, Fabris tells you to be safest of all, your arm should be very extended, but not quite extended, right? Not fully extended. Your arm needs to be relaxed, right? here you see, you can definitely see that little slope to the upper arm, right? The hand is below the shoulder. The arm is not hyperextended. This is kind of the best of both worlds situation. It's definitely leaning towards the advantages of the very extended sword, but we still want to maintain control of it. So that's why this is his well-formed terza, and this is not. Right? This is really how it should look. You always want to keep your arm relaxed, and even as you thrust, even as you lunge, there should be no hyperextension of that arm. You want to think of punching your body through, and your arm and sword are simply an extension of your body. Right? You don't need to extend it any more than that at any point, regardless of the guard that you're in. At least that's the way he would want you to do it. And so stay relaxed. Now, lastly, he basically tells you that, you know, like I said, there's no single way to fence, and you really want every tool you've got in your toolkit. So all these guards, all these ways of holding the sword, they're all good depending on the situation. There may be times when this may be exactly what you need. Maybe you really need to bury that sword under you, and you want to keep it strong. Right? Maybe you've just extended your sword at him, and then he comes to find it, and you pull it back. Say, no, you're not going to find me. Right? For instance, but having all of these things in your toolkit and understanding the pros and cons, the advantages and liabilities of all of them, that's what you want to learn as fencers. And of course, once you've understood that, now you know how to read your opponent. Right? Because anything he does is going to be some version of this. So once you see that, you can kind of start to understand what he's trying to do or what he's capable of in that situation. Right? Knowing what it is you're facing will be as important as knowing how to use your own tools. Okay, that's what I've got. Anybody have any questions or comments about this?
I had one question about something he says when he's referring to attacking a sword held at an angle.
Mm-hmm.
On page 27 at the top, he says you should be mindful to have not only the advantage of the sword, which I do understand, but also of body and foot. I'm not sure what he means by advantage of body and foot.
Okay, hang on. We're looking at. Okay, page 27.
27 according to the text, not the PDF.
Oh, right. Sorry. Sorry. Which paragraph?
Right at the top.
Right at the top. If you want to talk about, should be on the advantage of the sword, but also body. Okay. Now we're going into Dan. You should be able to, Dan or Nick, you should be able to answer this, because this goes right back to Vigiani theory. Right? Having advantage of the sword means, you know, being in a proper situation of advantage. You know, basically, you found him; he hasn't found you. Right? You engage to your advantage. Body and foot. So if he's pointing at you, right? If his sword is pointing at you, you do not have advantage of the body. If he's not pointing at you, you do. Right? This goes to counter guards. Right? Counter guards are basically a form of finding a sword where, you know, you have completely shut him out of your own line. He's not pointing at you. Having advantage of the foot will be a matter of where your weight is, what your stance is and where your weight is. For instance, if I've gained the measure, found his sword, and there's the tempo, but my weight's on the wrong foot, I can't lunge. Right? So in other words, I need to be at the, I need to have settled in a guard, a stance appropriate for the situation. It's also a matter of is my body supported by my feet? In other words, structure, right? Structure and balance. So advantage of the sword, right? Taking care of what's out there. Advantage of the body, making sure that my body is safe, usually behind my own sword. And advantage of the feet, having my feet properly situated and aligned with each other, and my weight properly situated so that I can take advantage of any given situation.
Does advantage of the body have something to do with not being in the line of attack?
Exactly. That's exactly it. Right? If he is not pointing at you, then you have advantage of the body. And one of the ways of doing that is placing your sword in the way, placing your blade in the way of his blade, and removing your body from his sword. And that's a way of forming a counter guard. All right. That answer your question, Tony?
It did. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I had a question.
Yeah.
In the 5th paragraph, kind of midway through 25, he says, he will find it difficult to get near enough to wound you since he sees your point so close at all times. Does Fabris have an expectation of the posture his opponent will be using? Because in Capo Ferro, obviously your point will be farther away from them than if they're in a forward leaned stance.
Okay, well, I think regardless of his posture, it's going to be
closer.
Your point's going to be much more in his face, depending on your posture, right? So if he is simply hanging back in a Capo Ferro stance, and you are in a very, very extended Fabris stance, his point will be closer to him than if you are also in a rear refuse stance, right? So regardless of how he fences, your point will be closer to him in this particular method.
Sure.
Now, of course, if you do expect him to fence in a forward stance, then yeah, it's right in his face. And especially, as you know, when you're both in a Fabris stance and you get in the measure, your point is basically almost at their hilts.
Right.
Yeah.
But did Fabris? I mean, Fabris is obviously teaching this agnostically. This works regardless of the posture. But do we have any idea of his expectation of what he would be facing?
No, no. And he, just like he says towards the end of this chapter, he expects you to be able to fence effectively, regardless of what your opponent is doing,
sure.
Right? And understand the pros and cons of whatever your opponent is doing. He also says in the following chapter on holding the body that he obviously he wants you to fence with your body a certain way, but if you can't, if it's too tiring, better that you should be more erect so that you can actually control your actions, right?
Yeah.
So he hopes that you're going to fence his way, but he expects that even if you can't, you still know what to do. Incidentally, the very hyperextended guard, that's probably the closest guard to the distressa guard that we've seen. Right? So that gives you an idea of the pros and cons of that particular guard. Right? He's sticking it out at you. You can easily find his sword if he, unless he manages to keep it free. And interestingly, one thing that the Spanish fencer will try to do will be to find your sword, and with the atajo, which what is that? It's going from a straight guard to creating an angled guard. All right. And if you are able to take advantage of the tempo in which he creates that angled guard, then you've got your way in. Again, it's all about tempo. Okay. All right. Anything else?
A question for me.
Yes, sir.
For the withdrawn guard, you showed a plate that uses that action, and I think we all have either seen something like that or understand where it comes from. Does he have plates showing the extremely extended guard, or is that more the sort of thing that he says you can use it if you need to, but otherwise, nah?
That's why I actually had to dig up a German plate for that, because no, he does not show that much. All of his plates, at least I'm pretty sure all of his plates, even at their most extended and regardless of whether it's the guy hitting or the guy being hit, the arm tends to be still in a fairly relaxed extension. So yeah, you don't tend to see hyperextended guard unless you look at his prima. His prima tends to be, and again, it's above the shoulder. His prima tends to be the straightest guard that he shows, right? Straightest in terms of what the arm is doing. And we all know how comfortable prima is.
Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, sorry, he doesn't show that. Anything else, guys? Okay, good. So it looks like we took up the pretty much the whole hour. There is still some homework to look at. I think Mark and Jim had some videos to show. I will start with that on Saturday. And before Saturday, I will have something else I want you guys to look at. It will be posted on the website. It will be involve controlling the line. If you have not seen it yet, you should take a look at the very first instructional video that I posted way back, about a month ago, that got posted on Facebook. It's I think it's listed on the website as the special lesson basic rapier mechanics, something like that. Take a look at that. It's a 12-minute video. I talk all the way through it, so you'll enjoy that. But that is basically what we're going to be looking at on Saturday, and looking at ways to practice that. All right. Okay.
Posted the link in the chat. It is special lesson basic body mechanics.
That's what I thought. Okay. Thank you, Alicia.
Yep.
Okay. Last chance. Anything else, guys?
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Thanks. You've been great. I will have a great week. I hope to see you all on Saturday, and scholars, and companions, I hope to see you on Thursday.
Yep. See you then.
All right, guys. Have a good night.
Thanks, John.
Still on camera, by the way.
Sorry.
Gabrielle.
Hi.
Yeah, you blew it.
Are you off now?
Yes.